now to a Supreme Court case that's not getting nearly the amount of attention it deserves. Janus versus AFSCME. Okay, here's some background. A non-union government worker from Illinois named Mark Janus is suing the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees Council 31, or the AFSCME for short. His complaint? State union laws violating his First Amendment rights. How so? Well, the union forced him to pay union dues to keep his job despite opting out as an official member of the union. Janus is arguing that all public sector unions are political at their core because they negotiate the contracts with the government, which affects public spending, workers, and services. The union, they don't think so, saying that public sector employees benefit from its bargaining power and that Janus is just trying to be a free rider. Well, joining me now to discuss is Adam Carrington, Assistant Professor of Politics at Hillsdale College. Adam, thanks for joining me.
Glad to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
All right, first off, are you a little shocked that we're talking about union power potentially losing some steam here, and we're seeing almost no coverage on the mainstream media networks?
It seems extraordinary given that unions themselves are claiming that this could be the death of them, that especially those more on the political left aren't sounding an all cry for it. I think you're absolutely right. And it's strange to think about why. Is it because they're not depending on unions as much? Is it because they believe it's a foregone conclusion? I think you're right. Silence is strange and unexpected on this.
And so which way do you think the Supreme Court is going to go on this? I mean, I'm pretty sure Neil Gorsuch is going to vote with Mr. Janus, but how do you think the Supreme Court decision is going to come down?
Well, I think if Gorsuch goes that way, it's very clear that actually the unions will lose. Because we had a case very similar to this right before Justice Scalia died. And after he died, it basically ended in a 4-4 tie. And all of those 8 justices are still on the court. So if Justice Gorsuch goes that way, I think it's actually pretty clear that the unions will lose this vote, and Mr. Janus will win his day in court.
All right, so let's bring this to politics. I mean, we know, if you're a conservative, you know darn well that these unions, these public sector unions, give heavily, if almost exclusively, to Democrats, who are then responsible when they get elected for sitting down and negotiating contracts, which there's really no negotiation, right? I mean, they're all on the same side of the table, and that's something that really angers conservatives.
It angers conservatives, and I think the justices have been very attentive to that it angers the Constitution. That not only is this a raw deal for taxpayers, it means that there are people who don't agree with that kind of speech. They don't agree with a large size and scope of government, yet they are being forced to contribute union dues that participates in these expansions. In other words, they're being forced to speak with their money against their will. And the First Amendment, not just conservatism, but the First Amendment says not only can you not be punished for saying something you want to say, but it's actually wrong to punish somebody by forcing them to say something you don't want to say. And that's what's going on here. So not only I think conservatives, but I think people who are supportive of the Constitution and First Amendment free speech rights should be very concerned.
Here's a question for you. What is the origin of public sector union power in the first place? Where does a private sector labor organization get the power to come in and essentially turn government into a closed shop?
That's an interesting story. Back when these issues were blowing up with Scott Walker in Wisconsin, it was noted that even Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of all people, wasn't a big supporter of public sector unions. And I think there's a big difference there between private and public sector. Private sector unions can be restrained by the fact that the business has to stay afloat. It has to make money. There's some reason to keep it constrained and responsible. We've seen with government spending, there's no constraint like that. And therefore, what government employees can do is they can, 1, vote for their bosses, and then 2, negotiate with them, all with very little looking at the bottom dollar sign, because ultimately who's paying that? It's the taxpayers. So I think that distinction is really important and is often overlooked in these kind of discussions.
You know, if you're a conservative and you talk about the coercive power of unions, you get the pushback. Why do you hate working people? I don't think it's a question of working people. I think it's a question of who are these people to come in and essentially say, you have to pay these trolls, a fee to cross the bridge. Meaning, in order to get this job, you're not free to contract with your employer or free to apply to the job. Once you get this job, you now owe us. And if union membership was voluntary, purely voluntary, they'd have to behave better because people would leave.
Yeah, and I think there is something to people wanting to associate in order to try to gain advantages. That often happens. But at the same time, I think you're right. That should be part of our right to associate with each other, not something that's forced beyond our belief. And what that means is you're actually hurting the little guy who doesn't want to participate, the little guy who wants to stand up for his own beliefs. And I think in making the claim that this hurts, I think, American workers, I think actually this is something to uphold the freedom of American workers, not only in their First Amendment rights, but their rights to associate with others as they choose.
You know, one thing to point out is, and I remember studying the Knoxville, Tennessee Volkswagen plant issue with the UAW. If having unions control both the public and private sector were so great, why is it the right to work states are getting all the manufacturing jobs?
Yeah, and I think part of this is just understanding where we are economically, that system was much more prevalent and at least more workable. Whether it was just or not is a question, but it was much more workable in the 1950s when you had a combination of big government, big business, big labor. That's not the economy we live in. It's not, and therefore, if we try to impose that, we're actually going to, I think, hurt workers and hurt taxpayers rather than help them. I think we have to understand that protecting the rights of workers, protecting the rights of businesses, these things are all achievable, but they need to be achieved in an economy that looks a lot different than when that was the system that was running the day. That's just not the economy or the system we live in right now.
You know, and when it comes to campaign giving, they've gone all in for the Democrats. It's no wonder why they have very few friends that are Republicans.
And that's part of the problem too. If we really believe that government is supposed to be on the side of the voters and the people, I think this is part of the bigger problem of what they call the bureaucracy or the deep state, is that these career bureaucrats don't have a connection to the interests of the people that I think would be necessary if we're going to actually protect taxpayers' interests.
All right, Adam, thank you so much for joining me. We'll get you back on the program soon.
Thank you. It was great to be with you.